Hold the mic closer to your mouth.
Hello.
There we
go.
There you go.
The Trans Am pace car did not start out as the Indy 500 pace car. It started out in a conversation between Tom Goad, who was the specialty vehicles manager for Pontiac, and a fellow named Milt Shornack that used to work for Royal Pontiac. He was the performance manager and drag race person at Royal. And they had a conversation. Mr. Goad used to race, at that time he was racing SCCA Firehawk Series road racing, and he wanted a more powerful engine because he was only using a 305 two-port injection in his Trans Am, and they had a tough time running against the Porsches and the Corvettes and other things that ran in that class. And Mr. Shornack, in this conversation, he says, well, why don't we use the Buick Grand National Regal engine and put it in the Trans Am, because it's the most powerful engine General Motors making at the time. And he thought about it, and gave it some thought, and he says, well, tell you what, you think we could build one or two of these prototypes? And they said, well, I think so. But then Mr. Goad, throughout this whole project.
Hold it up closer.
Oh, I'll blow your ears. You don't want that. The whole project was never a real project like Mr. Ewell and Mr. Manor are generally dealing with. Mr. Goad didn't have very much money, and they didn't have Pontiac supporting it. So they built the first two prototypes in the Pontiac Engineering garage. And they got the engines, I believe, from Buick Engineering, and they built one stick and one automatic. Can you give us the white car? One more. This car. This was one of the original prototypes. And it looks pretty good in this picture, but if you raise the hood, it was a pretty tough car. They built one stick and one automatic, and they got them running, and they couldn't calibrate them very well because at this time fuel injection was very new. They didn't know how to do that. So the people at PASS, who Mr. Kelly used to work for, they were working on some of Tom Goad's Firehawk road racing cars. And they had a fellow there named Rich Anderson, and he could calibrate a fuel injection prom and the computer, so they calibrated and got it running. Well, they had a lot of trouble, and they actually blew the pistons out of it once. They blew the head gaskets out of it another time, and some other problems. And they kind of quit working on it for a while. And let's go back to the GTO. This is how I got involved in it. They were having a lot of trouble, and I believe, I'm not positive, but they approached Buick Engineering for help, and they helped them a little bit, and for whatever reason, then Buick Engineering couldn't help them anymore. And I used to work when I was a kid. I used to go down to Royal Pontiac and hang out, and when I was a teenager, and Milt Shornack was the performance manager there, and he knew me. And go one more, the picture with the, no, back this way, there. This fella right here, his name's Van Seymour. He was very well connected with Pontiac. He used to race Pontiacs. And he was connected with John DeLorean at Pontiac, general manager. But also, I used to go over and help him on this car in his garage. And that was quite a while ago in the 60s. Well, I went over there in December of 1986 just to see him when we were talking in his garage. And he told me that Milt Shornack wanted to talk to me and wanted me to work on a Trans Am with a turbo Buick V6 engine. And I said, well, I don't know. I don't think I could help him. Well, anyway, I gave him his phone number, and they called me at work 3 or 4 weeks later. And they formally asked me to come help them. And I said I didn't know what I could do, but before that, I was the senior manufacturing engineer for engine testing and also over warranty analysis at the Buick engine plant, where they made the Buick V6s and the turbo engines for the Buick Grand National Regals at that time. And I said, I can't really come help you because that's not in the way of line of demarcation, and that I would probably get in a lot of trouble. So what they did, they found out who was my boss's boss, who was the superintendent of master mechanics of the engine plant, named Darrell Galbraith. And they called him and told him they wanted me to come help him. So he called me in the office and told me, you can go down there and help them, but you can't spend any money, and you want to do it, you know, late in the afternoon, and make sure you don't do something that was formally done. So I went down, and let's go to the white car again. This, no, down there. This car was sitting in, I met Mr. Goad, I'd never met him before, and we went down in the parking lot, and he had two of these cars. He had this one and an automatic, and they looked just alike. And he showed me, he said, well, we got a few problems with this, and we think you can help us. And few was a very mild, he was being very diplomatic. He started outlining some of the problems, and to get the Buick Grand National Regal in the car, on the right side, the frame rail, they'd taken a chunk out of there, about 2 inches, because they couldn't get the turbo out exhaust pipe down between the engine and the right-hand side of the exhaust manifold of the Grand National engine. Well, they'd done that, and also it started up and it had this bad vibration, ringing. It went into a large... I'm sorry, I can't...
Can you turn the speaker?
I can't talk to the people in the other room.
No, turn the volume down on the side.
But I can talk this way. I'm sorry. So we looked at it. He said, well, let's go drive it. So we drove one of them, and it belched big blue smoke out the back of the tailpipe. And then we drove the other one, and it didn't drive very well. It had hesitations, and I could even tell it was spark knocking. It was vibrating. It wasn't very good either. And he says, well, we'd like you to help us fix it. And I was very diplomatic. How I told him, I said, well, I don't know what I can do. We've got to get some instrumentation and look at it. So I says, I'll see what I can come up with. And I went back and I reported my superior, Mr. Galbraith, and told him, looks like to me we're going to have to give them 2 engines to start over, because they got the blue smoke out was the turbo seal in the turbocharger bearings, and they would go out, and they'd somehow ruin those. And it would look like a mosquito sprayer, smoke coming out of it. And, no, I'm not exaggerating, it was pretty bad. And then the other one, I didn't know exactly what's wrong with it, but it was hurt. So he says, well, you got some of these returns down there. He says, see if you could patch up a couple of the, we couldn't sell them after they came back from the dealer, and I did a return analysis for warranty purposes. And so I had a repairman that worked with me, and his name was John Larman. He was a repairman at the end of the assembly line. And so we put together a couple engines, we sent them down there, and Mr. Goad was very, very appreciative. And I went down to engineering, I knew some people that worked there, and we cut a prom. Back then you couldn't calibrate it off a laptop. You had a prom burner, and you burn these proms, and that was the calibration. And so I got the guy to make me a couple of conservative ones, so that we knew we weren't going to overspark it or do something. And I had a little less boost, but it would run. So we sent that with the engines, and then I didn't hear from them again for a while. And then Mr. Goad called me up and had me come down. By now they had the cars a pass at Prototype Automotive Services. Yeah, I went down there and I drove them, and they drove pretty good. They were not as good as the ones you have now, but it was definitely better than any V8 they had. You could tell right away. And so he says, well, you know, we'd like to do something. And I said, well, okay, and he suggested he bring it back up to the engine plant and thank our management for helping them. And so they came up and they did a little presentation about what was in the cars, and they let our plant manager and the master mechanic and superintendent of the assembly line and some of the other guys that were interested, they all got turns right in the car. And they gave a little presentation of what it was and what it entailed to do this. And our plant manager he wasn't a real performance enthusiast, but he understood business, and at that time, the 3.8 liter V6 was not held in high esteem like the 3800 is today, and we were kind of slowly losing business. And he was looking for some extra volume that we could sell some engines to one of the car divisions, because we were kind of losing ground. And we knew that later on, a couple of years, we're going to switch over to the first 3800 Series 1, and it was going to not be as high a volume, so we're going to have a whole line of block line, head line, intake manifold line, exhaust manifold line, cam line, just sitting there doing nothing, and he was kind of looking for some business. So he didn't say, yeah, we're going to do this, but he says, he kind of made it okay to go ahead. And they did a formal cost study with the car assembly plant, which was then at Van Nuys, California. And they decided that they looked it all over, what it would take to maybe make 5,000 or 10,000 units of this, which is very low volume for General Motors. And they looked it all over, and the big cut out of the right side frame rail, it was going to cost $3 million to retool that in the car assembly plant. See, the Trans Ams at that time had just switched over to a unibody construction, where the Buick Grand National was still a body-on-frame construction, and that left more room in an engine compartment like in a Grand National. And when you start working on a unibody car, you've got the great big dies and big welding fixtures in the car assembly plant, very expensive. And it probably would have cost more than that if we actually would have done it. So they decided after that, we had a meeting, and they decided to cancel the project. It says, well, we just can't do it. They called Mr. Gold and told him we appreciate, bring up the cars, and that was it. And it stayed there for about 2 months. And, so I was working downstairs with my repairman, Mr. Larman, and we were working on regular dealer returns. And I happened to see a Grand National Regal engine, this engine, and a front-wheel drive. We were building an '86 model year by then. It was a front-wheel drive engine for the LeSabre, Pontiac Bonneville, and the Buick Park Avenue. And they were hanging on the line, one right behind the other. And I'm looking at that, and I'm thinking, no, the rear-wheel drive engine is narrower than the front-wheel drive engine, excuse me, I misspoke myself. The front-wheel drive engine is narrower than the rear-wheel drive. And I says, if we put those heads on the rear-wheel drive block, I think we could get that exhaust manifold down there without slicing the taking a big slice out of the front frame rail of the Trans Am. And Mr. Larman, we talked it over, and he says, I don't think all that stuff will fit. And I thought it would, because we hadn't gone to the 3800 yet and moved the center line of bores and moved everything. And so I got some heads, and I got a head gasket, and we went to lunch, we come back, and we started working on we had an extra turbo engine there, come back from the dealer. We took it all apart, and we started measuring it up. The head gaskets fit, the heads fit, and then we had to get head bolts, because in the front-wheel drive, it didn't take just regular torque. It was one of the first times which Buick pioneered was called torque-to-yield bolts. Very common in General Motors and many of the manufacturers today. It's called torque plus angle. You don't just put a torque on it, but you torque it to a certain level, and then you apply a number of degrees of rotation. And so we did that, and we got it put together, but we didn't have any exhaust manifold. And then we put all the front dress in the turbo, and when the intake manifold off the turbo would fit, because we still had the 2 ports together, and one port, it was like that. And this is the head on that side of the table is the front wheel drive head, and this is the normal Regal Grand National head, and everything fit. So we fired it up, and it ran. And well, nobody thought, my repairman didn't think it would work either, and nobody had done that. They didn't even think about it. We were working towards getting the next model year running, and we didn't do that kind of thing in the factory. And so we didn't have any exhaust manifolds, a little loud, and there's a fellow named Clark Berry, who was the superintendent of the assembly line, and he kind of liked the performance stuff. So I went up and told him, I says, I got a solution for a Trans Am that we just canceled here a few months ago that the Pontiac came up and showed us. And he says, and I told him what I did. He said, that won't fit. I says, well, you come down and you look, and we got one running downstairs. And he said, well, okay. So he goes downstairs, and we fired it up and ran it for him, and he just stood there and looked at it. I said, well, I'll be darned. He says, well, what do you want to do? I said, well, I don't know. We'd like to send it down to him. He says, well, tell you what. He says, I'll write your pass, but he says, we don't have any money. He says, since the program's canceled, I don't dare put anything that shows that we shipped this out of here. So I got it down there and just dropped it off, and I don't know if Mr. Kelly here or Billy Briggs was their engine builder at Pass. Somebody took it out. It was late in the evening. It was about 6:30, 7 o'clock, and they took it out and just set it on the floor, and I left.